We kind of have two agendas today because we have a university project. So we'll start with Agenda A. First I want to, you've got the minutes from the last meeting. Is there a motion to adopt the minutes? Can we take it by consent? Consent. All right, now you have an agenda in front of you. Is there any amendments to the proposed agenda? All right, then we'll go ahead with Phil.
Renovation, but what I have before you is a $3,460,000 renovation of Godare Hall. This is something we've been needing to do for a long time. It's mostly mechanical. We've been doing cosmetic work in the first semester. We actually displaced these students into the other dorms. Very rarely we get that opportunity. We usually have to squeeze all of our renovations in that short period of time between they walk out and when they come back on the 15th, which is a lot of work to do on a building this size. And so we're very happy with the price of the project, and it's really as simple as that. So I ask for your consideration of this project today, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, everybody. My name is Micah Vincent. I'm the Director of the Office of Management and Budget for Governor Holcomb, and this is Jason Dudich, the State Budget Director. And we appreciate the opportunity to come before you today and introduce the governor's budget to the State Budget Committee. I do want to just take a note of privilege to thank the agencies and the work of the State Budget Agency in particular. There is a lot of staff work, time, thought, diligence that goes into putting this budget together, as it always does in every budget. And I would be very, very remiss if I didn't take an opportunity to thank Jason and Zach and Lisa and their team, as well as the team at the agencies and other interested parties that weigh in on the budget. This is a process that certainly started well before today, well before December. It starts in the summer, really, as we start to think about how do we put together the budget that gets introduced today and then begin the process and goes to the General Assembly for your work. But I do want to start there, and again, just thank the team that puts this together. Again, not just within the Office of Management and Budget, or specifically within the Budget Agency, but also across state government and other parties that weigh in, that we talk to. There is just a lot of work that goes into what's before you today. So we distill it down in this to a few different documents, and so I want to make sure that we're level setting on what's in front of you. So we have the presentation that I believe we passed out copies to the members of the committee. That presentation will be posted online. There is a copy of the proposed budget bill that has been handed out as well. You've also received a copy of the surplus statement. There is the budget book that I believe was sent to you. All of those items will be posted online so that they're available not just to members of the committee but to anybody else that desires to have them and look at them. So those are through the State Budget Agency's website. They're probably, where are they, in Budget Committee area? Yep. And I'm told they're up there now. So So they're up and available and accessible now. So do appreciate letting me start with those two things, just that we're on the same page. Moving on to the next slide, any budget so this is the second of Governor Holcomb's budget that he's introduced, is really a fundamentally there's two pieces that in a very broad-based perspective that we think about in putting together a budget. One is the financial or fiscal policies that are important to the governor, that he and we are certainly in agreement of this, and we've seen the evidence of it, the kind of financial policies that support that support the prosperity of our state, the ability for our state to continue to move forward and be strengthened our economy. And so the two sides of that, one is the financial policies, fiscal policies, and then the other is the funding priorities. And so we'll talk about both of those items in this presentation. I'm happy to take questions whenever, and we will walk through these items. I'm confident there will continue to be questions and things. You know, we recognize this is a process that doesn't end until April 29th or whenever session ends. And so we'll continue to have conversations of our perspective, from the governor's perspective, and we'll work forward from there. So on this first slide, you see on here strong fiscal discipline and a balanced budget. You know, those two things are really, a balanced budget is the evidence of strong fiscal discipline. Those two things are very hand in hand, and very important because we want to make sure that we're avoiding scenarios where we're forced to make very difficult decisions at the worst time, in the worst time to either raise taxes or cut critical services is when there's a downturn in the economy, and maintaining strong reserves and an ongoing operating balance is really critical to be able to do that. So you see here, ongoing annual revenues meet or exceed ongoing annual operating expenses. You see that in the surplus statement that's in front of you. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Maintain the state's AAA credit rating from the three rating agencies, Standard & Poor's, Moody's, and Fitch. That's a very important piece of this as well. We just recently were reaffirmed by both Standard & Poor's and Moody's based upon what they've seen for the state of Indiana. And those continue to be important things as we move forward. The last two bullets on here, again, all of these things roll up into the broader principle of strong fiscal discipline, and which is evidenced and recognized by your credit rating. But the way you maintain those and keep that working going forward is a function of several things, but two of the most important are your reserve levels and your operating surplus in a given year. So you'll see these last two bullets. Our intent is that we maintain at least 11% in reserves, and we intend to end the biennium with at least $1.8 billion in reserves. Those two calculations, again, go hand in hand. They feed each other, but did want to definitely mention those two things. The next slide is historic and projected general fund forecasted revenue. So that first line, if you have the surplus statement in front of you, that first line in the under revenue for 2020 is 16583. That is the forecasted revenue that came out of the revenue forecast on December 17th of 2018. So in 2020, you see that as 16583. In the second year, you see the 16969. Those two numbers specifically are the two revenue forecasts that came out of the forecast on December 17th. This chart just shows you the historic and projected revenue. And so the 3 years that are 2019 is an estimate. It's in yellow here, that 16140. When I say 16140, what I mean is $16,140,000,000. But I'll probably keep, I intend to say it that way, but I'll probably keep saying 16140. That number was also from the forecast on December 17th. So those last three columns all are numbers that came out of the revenue forecast from December 17th. The next chart on page 4, I believe, of the statement that you have in front of you, or the presentation, is just shows you where, from what tax type those revenues come, going back through 2018, and then 2019 is the estimate based upon the most recent forecast, and 2020 and 2021 are the new forecasted projections. As you can see, sales and use continues to be a large driver for us. I do want to make one note on the chart. The chart starts at $4 billion, not at 0. And so one things that you might want to note is that sales and use tax continues to be our largest tax type. The blue on this specific chart is smaller than the orange, because the blue is also would include going down below that $4 billion mark. Just so from a reading the chart perspective, just as we tried to get it all in there and show it together that way. So our largest tax type continues to be sales and use tax. In many ways, sales and use tax, not in many ways, I'll not qualify that. Sales and use tax continues to be the most stable revenue source. That's been historically true. It's true not just in Indiana, but in other places as well, that of the very large tax types, which when I say that, I'm thinking about sales and use, individual, and corporate income tax, is sales and use is the most stable. It's the one that varies the least from month to month. Individual and corporate income tax have more variance built into their year, both as a function of the estimated payments, but then also just a function of how the year works, and then also, particularly with corporate, a smaller number of filers, and just so variance is felt more from a month-to-month basis. But sales and use continues to be the most consistent revenue source in terms of on a month-to-month basis, or even quarter-to-quarter. The next chart, again, is another way to see what we talked about in the previous chart, which is what percentage of does each tax type contribute to that overall forecasted revenue number. And so you can see sales and use tax is 48.6%. This is, I believe this chart is over accumulation of several years, but you can see those percentage numbers here. Any questions on revenue or tax types before I kind of move into the expenditure side? Okay, I'll keep rolling. So the next page, which is page 6, you can see the proposed general fund expenditure summary. So this is the percentage in each item of what percent of that total, so within those 2 fiscal years, so in this coming biennium, where does the money go from the general fund? And so you can see that 50.1% goes into K-12 education and teacher retirement. That's the largest piece of our general fund budget. You know, other large pieces are higher ed operating. You have public safety, Medicaid is a large part of it. That's all broken down in this chart. Not significant changes from previous biennia, but did want to have this before you so that you could see it. The next piece, the next slide, this is slide 7, is the NPERS historical and proposed appropriations of what you'll see in this budget. One of the things that is so key, we talked early on about there's financing policies and there's financial priorities and funding priorities. One of the things that's a funding priority that is really a financial priority is ensuring that we're fully funding the cost and what is sometimes called the actuarial cost of our pension plans. And maintaining that funding is so important to not getting behind fiscally. And so that's something that we've seen some states do, where to either to balance the budget within a particular year or to fund some other priority, they don't put in the requisite amount for pension funding. That has a adverse effect because that bill certainly comes due. And so that's something that we always highlight here. It's a funding priority, but that has a fiscal component to it. So that is slide 7. On slide 8, another that really fits in the same category, and the fiscal priority is to maintain a low level of debt funding. And you can see our historic debt funding levels, that they have come down consistently over the years, and we're expecting a similar effect in this budget. And I wanted to put this in front of you too, because when I talked earlier about the elements of a budget that contribute to what it means to be fiscally sound, what it takes to maintain a AAA credit rating from all 3 rating agencies, these, both the pension that I mentioned on the previous slide and this debt piece, are parts of that. And so those are important pieces as we talk about what it looks like to continue to be financially in a strong position going forward. The next slide I talked about more earlier than I perhaps should have, but just talks about the AAA credit ratings, the strong position that we're in. We continue to have a strong position. We're one of 13 states with AAA credit ratings from all 3 rating agencies. High rating states are able to save money on bond issuances. Also, our rate is utilized in the ratings for school corporations within the state of Indiana. And so our rating is very important to the rating that schools get when they go out for bond issuances. And so maintaining our rating is also an important part of the finances of school corporations within the state of Indiana. The next slide just shows that a little more on the AAA credit rating, which states have it, what the ratings are for various different states across the country. The next slide, as you look at the surplus statement that we passed out, you have a more detailed representation of what's on this slide. And so 2 things that we've talked about is having an operating surplus, and also having strong reserve balances. I do want to note, we talked about being above $1.8 billion. We talked about being at 11% of reserves is our target. You will certainly recognize that the numbers on this right-hand side of this page are higher than that. We recognize that where we want to make sure we land is at least 11%, and at least $1.8 billion. We recognize that there's the opportunity for some things that we've not included in this introduced budget today as part of that. The next part, Indiana's economy. A lot of this, I'm not going to go over a ton into this on funding priorities. These are items that were covered in the governor's announcement of the next level agenda, which he put out, I believe it was in late November or early December, when he talked about his priorities. And this is a part of that. These numbers are all included in the surplus statement that's in front of you. So all of these funding priorities are included and accounted for. Some of them are in other bills, but we did include them, other governor's agenda item bills, but we did include them in the surplus statement that's in front of you right now. Several of them are what I'll call revenue reducers. And so if it's a revenue reduction, it shows up above the line, so in that top portion of it, in the revenue side. If it's a spending item, then it shows up in the appropriation line item. So cover these really quickly. A number of these are changes to optimize our tax situation, various different tax credits, make the venture capital investment tax credit transferable, update us to become a market-based sourcing state. There's a few other things. The last one on this list is exempting military pension over a 4-year phase-in. We think that this is incredibly important to recruiting highly qualified workers to the state of Indiana. The next item is a series of capital improvements that you'll see. Capital improvements land in various different places on your surplus statement. I won't jump into all the details of that. I'll just kind of talk about this more openly, more broadly. But several of the different capital improvement items that are included in this introduced budget the continued funding for the Westlake Corridor and the South Shore double tracking projects at $12 million per year. The one that's you'll see below the line at the bottom is $150 million to get ahead of the curve on state-owned facilities in terms of their building maintenance and the work on them, just to make sure that we're putting in the costs now. That's part of, as we had higher reserve numbers, than taking one-time action to draw down future costs on buildings and just to make sure that our buildings are in a good state of repair. There's a $12 million in here for a third state police lab post. I sometimes had missed the post part of that as I've talked about this, but a state police lab post. And having these state police lab posts are very important in many of the things that state police does, and including and particularly in their work to fight what's going on in growth of drugs and other pieces. Other items on here, there is beginning in FY21, there's $3.5 million for state support debt financing of a swine barn at the state fairgrounds. We have $2.5 million in FY20 for design and engineering support of that barn. Also, a one-time cost that we have is $17 million for updated and new fish hatchery facilities at DNR. The existing facilities need update rather than continue these ongoing costs of updating those every year at higher and higher costs. It made more sense to move to creating new systems and new build-outs. The next item, moving to the next page, in workforce education and career training. The first item on this is to increase the K-12 tuition support by 2% each year. I want to walk through exactly what that means. So that means from 19 to 20 goes up by 2%, and from 20 to 21 goes up by 2%. So for that cost to go from 19 to 20 up by 2% is $143 million. And then to go from 20 to 21 is $146 million, but you still have that $143 million that is new money relative to what was there in 2019. And so the way that, one way to look at that is in the tuition support line item, that's $432 million of new funding based upon that 2% and 2%. Additionally, in addition to that, so actually, I'll step back. You could say that it increases by 4% over the biennium, but 2% per year. The other item to talk about is, just to make sure we're clear on the tuition support, is that when the governor announced his agenda in December, also talked about repurposing the teacher appreciation grant. And so $10 million of that $30 million grant was repurposed to increase the school supply tax credit for teachers. That's about $10 million. The other $20 million is being added to tuition support line item. Now, it is not part of the 2% that I talked about earlier. It is on top of that 2% that I talked about earlier in each year. And it was the governor believes and thinks that, that this is new funding that goes to school corporations. He would desire to see that go into teacher pay. The next item, there is, by the way we do things in the pre-K budget and plan, that we are increasing the number of children that are served by the On My Way pre-K. The next one I already talked about, increasing the school supply tax credit, increasing the funding for computer science training for educators. We talked about that in about a year ago as we move into the 21st century workforce, that as computer science becomes just really a fundamental piece of what's taught. We want to make sure that there's funding to train teachers to do that. Workforce Ready grants are going up. The increased funding for high school career counseling supported by the Workforce Cabinet. The Office of Work-Based Learning and Apprenticeship is going up by $1.8 million. The HIRE program, which was run out of DWD, is not being changed from a financial perspective, but is being moved from DWD to the Department of Corrections, where we think it can be better utilized to really train and prepare people as they leave the Department of Corrections to be ready for the workforce. The next chart shows historical funding of K-12 tuition support. I already talked about K-12 tuition support and what we have in this proposed budget, but I did want to also have this chart on here for you to see. And so that just shows those historical levels and the changes over time. The next slide is public health and attacking the drug epidemic. We'll continue to fund the secured school safety grants at $14 million per year and implement the August 2018 school safety report. That $14 million, if you recall, we augmented last year, and we're putting that augmentation in to permanently increase the funding of the secured school safety fund. DCS has been discussed. This budget includes the $286 million increase to their general fund appropriation that was talked about at Budget Committee, I believe, in December. So that's part of this. Another item, we have $3.3 million for an OB Navigator program to address infant mortality that was discussed in the governor's agenda in December. $1.1 million per year for youth-based risk behavior studies across all Indiana schools. Again, this is about securing schools. Continued support for safety pin and nurse-family partnership. And then the next item is fully funding the Medicaid forecast, which is a $84 million increase, and then an additional $123 million increase in the following year. That includes $7 million that was transferred from the Tobacco Master Settlement dedicated fund onto the general fund. So that's a part of that $84 million. We fund the CHIP plan based on new state matching rates set by the federal government. The last page here is good government, and run through just a few different items. We are making a 3.3% adjustment to base budgets for agencies to account for pay for performance and health insurance changes. There is $3.25 million for DLGF to modernize technology, so Department of Local Government Finance to modernize technology to provide more efficient services, particularly accurate reporting and online personal property tax system to improve the way that online personal property taxes are filed, significantly reduce the time it takes and ease of compliance. There's funding for the DOR new tax system. We had this in the previous budget, and that's as we move to finishing this project, there's funding here for that. We're funding the felon costs for the level 6 offenders. There's capital funding, $10 million of capital funding to support voter system upgrades by the Secretary of State. There's $1 million per year for the Lieutenant Governor's Nick Level Veterans Initiative. We are fully funding the required state contributions to pension and OPEB plans. A little bit of that we talked about earlier. One thing, the last item on here, we're ending on an accounting note, which I know everybody's excited about. But we are making changes to the Build Indiana Fund. Just the way it worked in statute previously was very difficult for us and to explain and convey just the way that accounting worked. And so we're making changes, adjusting revenues and appropriations. It's all net neutral, but just to make changes so that that Build Indiana Fund is easier for us to track financially and to administer. So I know everybody's excited to end on an accounting note. I know that's what everybody was here to do, but I do want to certainly open up the floor for any questions from the committee.
Questions from the committee. Senator Talion.
Thank you. A couple of questions. The money to DCS, 286, that's million, that's each year, right?
Each year, but it doesn't build on top of it itself.
Okay. So my question is the governor expecting DCS to do anything different from the way it currently operates before we give them all this money? In other words, are we going to require them to make some operational changes like were listed in the evaluation and recommendations?
Sure. So the CWG report that came out, I believe this summer, maybe in June, had a number of recommendations that are part of it. That is something that the Department of Child Services is working on fully implementing those. A number of them have been implemented already, and they'll continue to work on that. And so we're happy to continue to engage in that dialogue on specific items, but that CWG report, a number of them have been implemented, and we'll continue to work on the implementation of those items.
Thank you. Couple more questions. So the way I see this, there is no new money, new dollars, that is specifically targeted for teacher pay increases. Isn't that fair to say?
Well, we believe that there is an increase in the tuition support line item that goes to schools of $143 million in the first year, and then as compared to the current fiscal year, $289 million. Again, it's 143 and then that additional 146. That money goes to school corporations, so that's an increase that goes to school corporations as they work with their teachers. We would be hopeful and expectant that we see increases to teachers through that. Additionally, we talked about the school supply tax credit and changing how the teacher appreciation grant works. We would have similar expectations on that as well.
Well, okay, so let me ask about that. The $30 million that used to be performance and now it's appreciation, whatever it's called, $20 million of that is just being rolled back into the funding formula, and there's no requirement, there's no guarantee that it will ever end up in teacher salaries, right?
Sure, and so we share your concern with the decisions that are made locally on teacher pay. At the same time, we also recognize the function of the local governing body to do that, and so it is, and we desire to continue to work with you of how do we see that these new monies that are going to school corporations do land in and have an impact on teacher pay, and that's a conversation that we expect to continue with you all.
Right. Well, good. I'm glad we can keep talking about that because we do have a proposal that we hope will do just that. My final question is, and I've been asking this for some time now, where is the missing $1 billion from the tollway renegotiations? Why doesn't that appear in the budget?
Sure. So, that's a question that I know has been asked, and one we talked about at Budget Committee in December. So I wouldn't change my answer any from December at the time when we did the legal review of how those funds, the flow of funds that were part of that, that it did not have to be appropriated, but we do recognize the position that you're stating and haven't changed our answer from December, but we do recognize that that's going to be something that's talked about.
Okay, so I mean, it's your position or the governor's position that is sort of off of the budget money.
Well, I do want to clarify.
It doesn't appear in anybody's budget, right?
Yeah, I do want to clarify when we say off the budget item, I do just want to make one clarification. There are a number of different reporting documents and things that the state of Indiana puts forward, whether it's our CAFR or other items that. So I didn't want to leave the impression that it's off the books. I think your statement is that it's not included in the introduced budget that we're putting forward today, and that is an accurate statement. But it is very much accounted for. It's in particular funds. Those funds are a part of our financial reporting that we do through the CAFR. So that I wanted to make sure I had that clarification.
Thank you.
Senator Talion, and we can always appropriate it too, so. I'm sorry, Representative Porter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much for your presentation. I have one question in particular. When I look at the general fund surplus statement, underneath capital line items, state agency and universities, I see a negative $177.8 million. Could you please enlighten me or give me specifics in regards to those projects that are losing or that would be cut with this? Also, in your presentation on capital improvements, the $150 million are one-time funding for the general fund repair for state-owned facilities. Are those dollars being shifted, or are they really new dollars?
I'm sorry, projects that are being cut, I'm not
The
sure I'm following.
the $150 million,
Oh,
or the one time.
I'm sorry.
I'm doing two questions at once because I'm quite sure that they some kind of way you blend them together. So I'm just going to ask them together.
yeah, sure.
Okay.
So
the 177 million, that one, and then your new money for 150 million for state projects.
Yeah, so on the surplus statement, the way that things get depicted on the surplus statement is that the top portion, so kind of it's in three portions: current year revenues, current year expenses, and then what we call below the line items. So in current year revenues, revenues are depicted as a positive. In current year expenses, expenses are depicted as a positive because they're expenses. And then in the bottom line, revenues are expressed as a positive number, and expenses are expressed as a negative number. And that's consistent with how it's been in past years. So when you see that negative 177.8, what that means is that there's an appropriation. There are appropriations in the amount of $177.8 million. So those are expenses, not reductions in expenses, when they're below there. And so that negative, that 177.8 there is a number of projects. So it is the $150 million that I mentioned of getting ahead of the curve on the condition of our state-owned facilities. There is what else was in the first year? There is voter security capital.
That's the $10 million.
2.5, yeah, so it's 5 and 5.
Okay.
Yeah, so those aren't reductions in appropriations, those are increases in appropriations, but because of just as we always depicted in the surplus statement. Any other questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Micah, taking you back to the discussion about the teacher grants. So, just so I understand, there was a grant program that was created under a prior year budget or prior legislation, and you're taking that, 20 million of that, adding it to the tuition support that we give to the local communities per student. So all it is here's an extra $20 million for tuition support. And then the $10 million is going to pay for an increase of $400 of the teacher supply tax credit.
That's correct.
Okay,
Yeah,
all right.
that's correct. And like I said in the depiction earlier, both what the governor said in December and what I would say today is that while we are rolling that into the tuition support line item, it would certainly be our desire, and happy to work with you on how this works, but certainly our desire to see that in teacher pay.
Okay. So we all, as members of the General Assemblies, we always receive requests from different school corporations about what they want or what they desire to have. $20 million is a lot less than that's been requested for tuition support increases. I mean, just over I can tell you from my school district, IPS, for example.
Yeah, may I jump in,
Yeah.
Senator? So, and I apologize if I did a poor job of this earlier. We're including a 2% increase, which is $143 million in the first year. So that is a $143 million increase.
Right.
On top of that is $20 million.
Right. So let me. That's why I was going to get to that. But,
Okay, I'm sorry.
Okay. So, but no, that's fine. I think it's good to discuss it. So, the $20 million that you intend to go to teacher pay increases has no quote unquote direction in it to go to teacher pay increases. That's what you want to talk to us about over the budget to see what we can do. But what about the other 143 million?
Yeah, I mean, I do think there's our opinion is that there is going to be a very robust discussion of how do we ensure that the money that goes to school corporations is appropriately assigned for teacher pay, at the same time that we recognize the function and form of the local school corporation governing body, and that works with their teachers. And so I do think that that's going to be that probably is going to be the discussion that we all will continue to have throughout this session.
Okay. Last but not least, it perplexes me how you could take a grant of 10 million and move it to a credit of 10 million. Because here's the problem. In order to use the credit, you have to have a liability, right? So the average teacher, if they do proper accounting, may get a refund, right? So what happens, so you're taking the money from a grant that goes directly to pay for supplies, and now you're changing it to, if you have a tax liability, you get to deduct it. To me, that that doesn't increase their pay. That doesn't actually, it could actually lower, because of, depending on how they do their tax returns, if they file jointly or head of household in some cases.
Yeah,
you
so
could lose that difference that you're talking about of $400. You don't necessarily realize that. You can carry it forward, I'm sure, but I don't know. But why go from a grant to, why not just leave it as a grant, allow the teachers to apply for that grant so they realize dollar for dollar? Because some teachers may not have a tax liability.
Sure. So, and it's I'm pretty sure it's a refundable tax credit, so it's not dependent upon their overall liability. And so I'd make that the first point. As long as there are those expenses on the school supplies, which in talking with teachers is a pretty consistent theme, that they do spend significant amounts of money on school supplies. As it pertains to the overall, I mean, this is an overall neutral item. So I'm not implying anything other than that. Do recognize that the overall neutral, as long as we see the $20 million go into what we would hope that and intend that it goes into. And so we received positive initial feedback on it, but we're very open to continue to work on what is the right way to do this.
Micah, so you take the 30 million teacher grant, you roll 20 of it, which goes straight to teachers. You roll 20 of it into the formula, and in your mind, 10 still goes straight to the teachers and the teacher credit. And, I'm pretty sensitive to it because, it's always been a Senate priority. And my only concern is in some schools, that's the only pay increase that some teachers see, is that grant. I mean, I realize there's an argument it doesn't go to the base, so it's not technically a pay increase. But for that given year, in some cases, that's the only increase they do see. So I still like the idea that money goes straight to the teachers. Okay. So I would like to continue to discuss that with you.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for the presentation. I had a question about your expansion of the On My Way pre-K. Are those 500 additional children you're talking about, are they under our current eligibility requirements, or are you expanding the eligibility requirements?
That's at the current.
I'm sorry, current?
At the current.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions?
Thank you.
Anything you'd like to add?
Well, we do appreciate the opportunity to come before the Budget Committee. I started this with, obviously this reflects the governor's, both his funding and his financial priorities, and we appreciate the opportunity to come and be able to present those before you. I'll end the other way that I started to, and just thank the teams that worked so hard to put all of this together. Thank you.
Is there any committee discussion? Representative Hamilton?
Thank you, Chairman. I guess I just want to reiterate Senator Tallian's comment about the missing $1 billion and note that I appreciate the chairman's suggestion that we should incorporate those dollars into the budget. It's unfortunate, I think, that we need to do so, and it's important that we do. Thank you.
Any other comments?
Move acceptance of the agenda.
Can we take the roll?
Representative Porter. Senator Talion.
Yes.
Chairman Brown. Yes. Director Dudich.
Yes.
Chairman Mishler.
Yes. It passes 5-0. Thank you. What'd you forget about me?